house where they watched the Battle
As
of the
you
North
are walking,
Bridge.
folks, I wanted to say a couple of things. One is, this looks like just a little road or path right now, but this was the major thoroughfare in town. And so you have to imagine 180 redcoats who came marching down this road. There was another group in town, and there were other groups stationed in other places. But this was really the main thoroughfare in town at the time. The other thing that I want to mention to you as we walk by the Old Manse, which is such a beautiful location, remember that there were almost no trees. And so as we go by, you can just think about what the view of the North Bridge and that battle would have been for Reverend Emerson as he saw it take place. It would have been amazing. Very different than the one that you saw in Lexington, and this was erected 37 years later. And this monument is a tribute, obviously, to this battle. And so it says, here on the 19th of April, 1775 was made the first forcible resistance to British aggression. On the opposite bank stood the American militia, and here stood the invading army. And on this spot, the first of the enemy fell in the war of that revolution which gave independence to these United States. In gratitude to God and love of freedom, this monument was erected in 1836. Now, oftentimes people will ask, why is the monument here rather than on the other side if the American militia were over there? And the answer is the Concord River that you're looking at, because at the time this was dedicated, there was no bridge here. It had washed out. The river has over time washed out 5 bridges, and so that would account for this being here. If you step over here, you will see the grave of the first 3 redcoats who fell in the Revolution. So this is an actual grave site. The words that are on this monument are from the poet James Russell Lowell, and they mark this site.
This is
the flags that are here were placed by representatives of the British Diplomatic Corps. We celebrate something here that is called Patriots' Day in April. It is a huge holiday for us, much bigger than the 4th of July, for instance. So I encourage you to think about coming back and visiting this area in April. It's really quite wonderful. And that was the occasion on which these flags were placed. There are representatives of the diplomatic service who attend a number of these events. And the flowers were also placed, I understand, by individuals with another British military unit who came to this site. So now I invite you to walk across the bridge with me. Great. So folks, this is the famous Minuteman statue. Although I am from Lexington, I am here to confirm what you can probably see, which is, this is a much better statue. This was sculpted by a 23-year-old MIT dropout whose name was Daniel Chester French. This was his very first commission, and he was a resident of the town of Concord. And moreover, his art teacher was May Alcott, Louise's sister.
Okay.
So isn't that an interesting connection? And of course, she is portrayed in Little Women as Amy, the artist. Daniel Chester French went on to sculpt the statue of John Harvard in Harvard Yard, and most importantly, the Washington Memorial.
Oh, wow.
Sorry, the Lincoln Memorial.
Lincoln,
I beg your
yeah.
pardon. Yes. So he is indeed an important sculptor. One of the reasons why I like this statue is because it really very accurately depicts who the Minutemen were. They were farmers predominantly, and when the call went out, they laid down their plows and they took up their arms. Now, somebody on the way down here asked me about this term Minuteman, and in fact, it is a little interesting because not every town had Minutemen. Some of them had militias. And militia units were, in essence, the most rudimentary of volunteer firemen units that you could imagine. They were basically guys with guns. And they did the best that they could, but they did not have formal training. Minutemen groups, which some towns had, drilled regularly, and they received a little bit of money for their efforts. And in return, they committed to being able to respond to an alarm within 30 minutes. That's why they were called Minutemen. So that's the difference, really, between those two terms. So Concord had a Minutemen group. Lincoln had a Minutemen group. Lexington had a militia. Difference. And that also may account for the reason why there were so many losses on the part of the men of Lexington in that battle. Well, this statue is in fact the symbol that you will see on the U.S. Treasury note. It is the symbol for the National Guard, and it is also on the Massachusetts Quarter, so you may be familiar with it. Now, the inscription that is on the base of the statue comes from Ralph Waldo Emerson's Concord hymn, which would have been sung at the time this statue was dedicated, to the tune of Old Hundred in its traditional meter, and it would have sounded something like this. By the rude bridge that arched the flood, there flagged to April's breeze unfurled. Here once the embattled farmer stood, and fired the shot heard round the world. Some of you will, thank you. Some of you will recognize that tune. And so this would have been quite a patriotic hymn, really, at the time. Now I want to, of course, tell you about this battle. Why is this called the shot heard round the world? Well, if you look up on the hill behind us, that is where the farms of Colonel James Barrett and Major John Buttrick were. And in fact, they're still up there. You can still see them. And back in Concord, remember that there were almost no trees. We have redcoats back in Concord, and the town is there. Out here in this field, we have 300 to 400 colonists who are gathered in this area because that call has been going out. You remember the story I've been telling you over and over again about how people would jump on a horse and they would ride to a neighboring town and they would help to sound the alarm. Well, the result is 300 to 400 colonists out here. Back across the bridge, remember that we have 60 redcoats on the far side, standing guard for the men that have gone up to these farms. So that sets the stage for this confrontation. Now, back in town, the redcoats who were there found something called the Liberty Pole that the colonists would put up. It was essentially a tree cut down with a red cap on it, and it was done by the colonists in their towns to mock the redcoats. It was kind of an in-your-face thing. Well, they set fire to it, and the fire caught fire to the town meeting hall roof, which was located about where that church was that we went by. A woman in town begged the men to put the fire out, and very nicely they did so, but not before the smoke was seen by these men who were up on the hill. They became more and more alarmed, and two men, Abner Hosmer and Isaac Davis of the neighboring town of Acton, said to Major Buttrick, "Will you let them burn the town down?" And then they led the rush of all of these men down here where they took up position right where you are, facing across the bridge. Well, tensions grew increasingly short and heated, I would say. People were getting very nervous. The redcoats were getting nervous because they saw how badly outnumbered they were. And then one of them started pulling up planks in the bridge. This was not a good idea because how were these men going to get back across the bridge? They weren't thinking about that, obviously. Well, then somebody fired. And once again, this unleashed the firing, and these two men, Hosmer and Davis, that were at the front of the line fell. And it was at that moment that Major John Buttrick gave the historic order, "Fire, fellow soldiers, for God's sake, fire!" And the firing commenced, and two redcoats fell immediately, and another was wounded and fell and died shortly thereafter. Well, the redcoats were not only stunned that the colonists had confronted them and fired back, but they started to realize how badly outnumbered they were. And they not only retreated, they turned and they ran all the way back to town. The reason why this is called the shot heard around the world is that this confrontation marks the first time that the colonists deliberately and purposefully took on the mightiest army in the world and bettered them. It had never happened before, and it was a stunning change in behavior. So that is the story, and what we're going to do now.
This is view from the North Bridge, north of Concord. That's the old manse.